The princess accidentally chose a human warrior, unaware he would transform her life forever. The crystal shattered the silence before I had even raised my hand. I was standing in the center of the Hall of Champions on Erith Station, surrounded by 300 pairs of watching eyes, and the kind of silence that only gathers in rooms where something ancient and important is being decided. The resonance crystal floated at eye level before me, pale gray and perfectly still, suspended in the ceremonial field that had held it through 21 generations of Serenthari selection ceremonies. In all of those generations, across all of those ceremonies, that crystal had never once been wrong. It had chosen warriors who became legends. It had rejected perfect candidates who later revealed catastrophic flaws of character that no intelligence file had anticipated. My grandmother had trusted it completely. My mother had trusted it. Every ruler of our bloodline had trusted it, because the crystal had never once given them a reason not to. It was glowing in the wrong direction. Not toward General Varric of the Iron Clans, whose 7-foot frame and battle record spanning 40 wars had made him the clear and widely expected choice, the man that every political analyst and court official had spent 3 weeks quietly assuming would be selected. Not toward the Voxian Scion Blades who stood in their perfect formation along the eastern wall, silver armor humming with contained psychic energy that made the air around them feel charged, like the pressure before lightning. Not toward the Dravaki Titan soldiers who had crossed 6 star systems for the chance to be considered. Not toward any of the warriors who had spent years training for this specific moment, who had given up other postings and other opportunities and crossed significant distances simply to stand in this room on this day. The crystal's light was stretching across the full length of the hall toward the far entrance, toward the main doorway, toward a human. He was not supposed to be there. That was the first thing I registered, before any other assessment. Not what he looked like, not who he was, only the simple wrongness of his presence in that specific space, at that specific moment. He was wearing a field uniform, the practical kind that soldiers work in rather than the ceremonial kind they wear for official appearances. It was clean, but not pressed, functional, and entirely without the formal weight that every other person in that room was carrying in their attire. He was holding a paper cup of something hot that sent a thin thread of steam into the cooler air of the hall. He was looking around the chamber with the specific expression of a man who had entered a door with confidence and was now becoming aware, in careful stages, that he had arrived somewhere entirely unexpected. 300 warriors, dignitaries, court officials, and members of my imperial household all turned at the same moment to look at him. He looked back at them. His gaze moved across the assembled crowd with a deliberate steadiness, the kind that comes from training rather than from simple composure, and then his eyes found the crystal, floating in the center of the hall, glowing white and steady, its light extended toward him like an arm reaching across a room. He studied the crystal for a moment. Then his gaze moved to me. He looked at me the way a person looks at something they are genuinely trying to understand, without the deference or the performance that I was accustomed to receiving, without the social management that most people applied when looking at me directly for the first time. He was simply looking, processing. "Is this?" he said, and glanced around once more at the formal tapestries, the ranked ceremonial weapons mounted on the walls, the assembled nobility in their full formal attire. "Is this the wrong floor?" The silence that followed was of a particular kind I had never encountered in the Hall of Champions before. The silence of 300 people, all processing the same unprecedented event simultaneously, and none of them yet having decided what the correct response was. I had attended selection ceremonies since childhood. I had studied their complete history. I had reviewed every documented irregularity across 21 generations of records. Nothing in those records came close to this. My chief advisor, Celine Drath, appeared at my left shoulder. She was among the most composed individuals I had encountered in 30 years of court life. a woman who had navigated 4 succession crises and 2 civil border conflicts without once losing her formal posture or allowing anything resembling panic to show on her face. She leaned close to my ear, and her voice was barely breath. "Your Highness, the crystal has made its selection. Protocol is clear." "I know what protocol requires," I said. I said it with complete calm, because every person in that room was watching my face, and the way I handled the next 90 seconds would be studied and analyzed and referenced for the next 100 years of Serenthari political history. I needed my face to show certainty. I needed my posture to show this was under control. I needed to project, with every available channel of nonverbal communication, the message that the Empress Designate of the Serenthari Empire was not disturbed by what had just occurred. I was disturbed, but I had 30 years of practice at my job, and my job required that no one see it. The law was not complicated. I had studied the selection rite with the same thoroughness I had applied to every other aspect of my formal education. The bonding that occurred when the crystal designated a champion was legally established from the moment of designation. It could not be set aside by royal will, by council vote, by political negotiation, by the wishes of the designated royal, or by the wishes of the chosen champion. It ran for 1 full standard year and ended at the crystal's own recognition of completion. To attempt to void it was to void the authority of the rite itself, which was the same authority that had legitimized every Serenthari succession in history, including my own. 1 standard year, 12 months. I was going to have a human champion for 12 months, and the only thing I could control was how I responded to that established fact. I straightened my posture to its fullest extent. I aligned my chin to the precise angle my tutors had spent 3 years refining, the angle that communicated authority without aggression, certainty without the performance of it. I walked forward through the silence of the hall, through 300 watching eyes, across the full length of the space, until I was standing 3 feet from the human in the doorway. Up close, he was younger than I had initially assessed. He had the compact, functional build of someone who had spent years training for work that needed to be done rather than work that needed to be watched. His hair was dark, his eyes were brown, and meeting mine with a steadiness I found immediately and specifically difficult to categorize, because it did not correspond to any of the 3 common responses I received when beings looked at me directly for the first time. He was not performing deference. He was not managing awe. He was not calculating political neutrality. He was looking at me the way a person looks at something they genuinely intend to understand, and that, in a room full of people performing carefully managed responses, was unusual enough to register distinctly. The cut along his jaw had healed poorly, the specific kind of scar left when medical care is inconvenient or temporarily unavailable during fieldwork. His rank insignia identified him as a sergeant. His name tag read Cole, E. His Republic Marine Corps insignia indicated he was on active secondment status to Ereth Station. "Sergeant Cole," I said, keeping every element of my voice in its proper register. "By the law of the Serenthari selection rite, you have been designated my champion. This bond is legally established from this moment. You will be provided with comprehensive documentation of your rights and responsibilities under the rite within the next standard hour. The term of service is 1 standard year. Do you understand what I am telling you?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the crystal again, which continued to glow with steady, unambiguous white light, as though it had made its decision, and saw no need to reconsider it. He looked at the crowd. He looked at me. Then he took a slow, deliberate sip from his paper cup, as though he needed exactly that much time to settle something internal. He reached to the side and set the cup down on the edge of the nearest display stand with a care that I would later recognize as a consistent characteristic. "I understand, Your Highness," he said. "Where do you need me?" I had a prepared speech. I had written most of it myself and practiced it that morning, a formal declaration of purpose, an acknowledgement of the assembled warriors, a statement of imperial commitment to the tradition of the rite. It was a good speech, and would have served the occasion well. I said none of it. I turned and walked back across the hall to my seat, because standing in front of this man for another moment, while he looked at me with those completely untroubled eyes, was doing something to my composure that I did not want to be visible, and I had a reputation that 3 decades of careful work had built and was not willing to compromise. Behind me, as I walked, I heard him ask one of my door guards in a low and entirely polite tone whether there was somewhere nearby he could throw away his cup. His name was Ethan Cole. He was 31 years old, placing him in what human physiology considered its functional prime, and what Serenthari biology would have placed at approximately the equivalent of a young adult who had recently completed their foundational education and was entering their first independent chapter. He had served 8 years in the Human Republic Marine Corps across 4 combat deployments, receiving commendations for valor on 2 separate occasions. He was currently assigned to a peacekeeping observation post on Erith Station when an administrative error generated a transit pass with an incorrect platform designation, which placed him on the wrong transport, which delivered him to the wrong level of the station, which led him through the wrong corridor to the wrong door at the precise moment the resonance crystal was making its selection. Whether the universe had been careless or very precise was a question I did not yet know how to answer. My household staff processed the situation with the professionalism I expected of them, which meant handling a completely unprecedented development without visible distress or any commentary that could be characterized as personal opinion. Advisor Drath arranged the formal documentation and briefing materials. Commander Vale, my guard captain, conducted the security orientation with an expression that occupied the specific narrow space between professional neutrality and significant personal reservation. The staff assigned Ethan his quarters, his access credentials, and his official schedule without any acknowledgement that any of this was unusual. Within 12 hours, the commentary had begun in other places. I monitored it, because I always monitored the information that moved through and around my household, and the picture it presented was not complicated. The court's assessment, the selection was an embarrassment. The human was fundamentally unqualified by any reasonable metric. The ceremony had been compromised by an administrative error that should be treated as an exceptional case. The appropriate response was to minimize his actual function, maintain his ceremonial presence, and allow the year to pass without incident. I was not going to agree with this publicly, because publicly treating the crystal's designation as a mistake was the same as questioning the tradition that underpinned my own succession's legitimacy. But I was, in those first days, privately operating on the assumption that my court was substantially correct about his practical limitations. What I watched in the following weeks disrupted that assumption in stages, each stage arriving before I had finished processing the previous one. Ethan asked questions. That was the first thing I noticed, and it kept consistently resisting my attempt to file it away neatly. He asked my senior archivist about the complete documented history of the selection rite, and what the official records said about the variation in champion types across different centuries. He asked Advisor Drath about the structure of my household's chain of command and how it integrated with the ship's standard security hierarchy. He asked Commander Vale about standard security protocols for royal transit convoys and what the current threat assessment looked like for our planned route. He asked my navigator about the transit corridor through the shard fields and its documented incident history. He also, on day 3, submitted a formal access request for my current threat assessment file. He submitted it through the correct administrative channel with the proper authorization request language, the kind of procedural correctness that indicated he had read the relevant documentation. I approved the request. I told myself it was because the request was procedurally correct and there was no legitimate grounds to refuse it. I did not examine the other reason carefully, which was that I was curious what he would do with the information. He read the full file that afternoon and came to the following morning's briefing with 3 specific questions about Kethrul activity patterns referenced in the border security section. The questions were precise and operationally relevant, Not the questions of someone demonstrating awareness of a topic, but the questions of someone trying to understand what they were specifically responsible for protecting against. After the briefing, he spent 2 hours walking the perimeter of my residential section of the ship with one of my senior guards, identifying entry and exit points, noting coverage gaps, documenting the maintenance access panels and their potential as unauthorized entry routes. He did this without being asked. He did it with a focused purposefulness that appeared almost casual and was, I was beginning to understand, anything but. Each evening, the access records for his ship credentials showed him pulling materials from the archive. Translation guides for Command Register Serenthari, progressing from basic to intermediate to advanced. Historical records of previous champion deployments and their documented outcomes. Diplomatic summaries of the current political situation in the eastern border sectors. Detailed maps of the Menvac shard fields with documented hazard zones and incident histories annotated. He was preparing, systematically and without prompting, for a job he had been given no time to prepare for in advance. My court believed he was decorative. My instinct, which 30 years had taught me to take seriously even when it was inconvenient, was forming an assessment that did not align with that belief. I kept the assessment to myself and continued watching. I told myself the resonance crystal had made an error the gods would correct by morning. I did not yet know that the gods had been waiting for exactly this. The attack came without warning on a Tuesday. Ethan mentioned this afterward with a dry calm that I recognized as the way he processed things that could not be fully processed in the moment, and I noted it without comment. We were 3 weeks into the transit corridor through the shard fields of Menvac. The route had been cleared by 3 independent intelligence assessments, all of which rated the current threat level as low and declining. The shard fields had been technically at peace for 6 years, which in practical terms meant the formal mechanisms of conflict had been suspended while the interests that generated it continued to operate through less visible channels. It was the kind of region that reads stable in official reports and feels unstable to anyone who spends time in it, a gap between documentation and experience that had been noted and consistently ignored. Our convoy was carrying 14 officials, a support staff of close to 40, and the preliminary documentation for the Menvac Accord renewal. That accord, concluded successfully, would define and secure the eastern border of the Serenthari Empire for another generation. It was the most significant item on my political agenda for the year, which meant it was also, though I had not thought about it in precisely these terms, the most significant reason someone might want us not to reach the summit. There are always interests that benefit from a border remaining undefined. There are always people who have built operational structures inside ambiguity and have strong motivation to keep that ambiguity intact. I was reviewing the final accord draft in my strategy chamber when the lights went out. Not a power failure. A power failure has a gradual quality, a dimming at the edges before the full cut. What happened to the corridor lights was surgical and instantaneous. The specific electromagnetic signature of a precision targeting pulse, the kind used to disable ship systems as a precursor to forced boarding. My guard captain's voice came through the emergency channel within 8 seconds. Hull breach confirmed at 3 locations. Attacker profile consistent with Keth Rule shadow hunters. All non-essential personnel to shelter positions. I had reviewed intelligence files on Keth Rule shadow hunters thoroughly. I had studied their operational history, their biological specifications, their documented tactical approaches. None of that review had prepared me for what it felt like to be their designated target in a corridor running on emergency lighting with no clear visual field and the certain knowledge that they could see me better than I could see them. Shadow hunters were not a naturally evolved species. They had been designed, deliberately, expensively, methodically, by a weapons development coalition that had since been formally dissolved under interplanetary treaty, but whose products had moved into the private market long before that dissolution and were available to anyone with sufficient funds and motivation. They were multi-limbed, capable of moving through ventilation systems and maintenance shafts as easily as through open corridors, and possessed a biological camouflage ability that made them nearly invisible in low-light conditions. Most critically, they had been engineered specifically to counter Serenthari biology, to anticipate the particular way our nervous systems process and respond to threat, to exploit the half-second coordination delay in our forearm threat response, to use our own instincts as vulnerabilities. My personal guard was exceptional. I want to be precise about this. Every one of them was among the best in the Empire, trained specifically for crown protection, experienced across multiple high-threat deployments, committed without qualification. They responded immediately and correctly when the alert sounded. They moved to their positions and they fought without hesitation. In 4 minutes, I lost 6 of them. I had never seen that before. Not in 30 years of political crises and border conflicts and the managed violence that empires generate in their operation. Not in any context. It was the efficiency of it that landed hardest, not the violence itself, but the speed, the way the shadow hunters moved through the specific gap between what my guards could do and what these attackers had been built to do, exploiting a biological targeting algorithm that had been engineered to find exactly that gap. I was moving through the secondary corridor toward the reinforced emergency shelter when one of them came through the ceiling panel directly between me and the shelter door. It had been in the ventilation shaft above me, which meant someone had studied this ship's layout specifically enough to know where the shaft openings intersected with the likely movement paths of the person they were targeting. The planning had been detailed. The shadow hunter dropped in a controlled fall and rose to its full height, and in the emergency lighting I could see almost nothing. A mass, a shape, limbs held with the stillness of something that has found what it was looking for and is no longer in a hurry. Ethan came through the maintenance panel to my left. The panel he had identified on his first perimeter walk, noted in whatever internal system he used for this kind of information, kept current. He came through it low and fast, and what followed was one of the most effective and least elegant things I have ever witnessed in 3 decades of observing trained fighters work. He did not fight cleanly. He had none of the formal precision of Serenthari blade training, none of the structured choreography of Voxian combat discipline. What he used was space, the specific immediate space of that corridor, every dimension and angle and surface of it, the position of every piece of equipment and furniture in the environment, the weight distribution and reach limitations of the shadow hunter's particular limb configuration. He wrenched a gravity plating panel from the floor and used it as a mobile barrier, absorbing 2 blade strikes and redirecting their force rather than trying to absorb it bodily. He used a length of cable he had been carrying to restrict the shadow hunter's upper limb movement at a moment when restriction was the difference between the situation being manageable and it being something else entirely. He used a pressurized food storage canister from the emergency supply closet beside the shelter door in a way that required precise knowledge of the canister's release mechanism, the shadow hunter's field of vision limitations, and the physics of a pressurized release in a contained space. Knowledge he had apparently assembled from some combination of reading and active attention to the ship's layout and a particular quality of mind that treated every environment as a set of potential resources. Beyond the immediate mechanics of the fight, there was something else I was registering that I did not have time to fully process in the moment, but that stayed with me afterward with a clarity that surprised me. He was afraid. Not visibly, not in any way that affected his decisions or his speed, but the physiological signs were there if you knew what to look at in a human. The elevated breath rate, the fine tension in the jaw, the particular way the eyes move when adrenaline is doing what it does to a biological system under genuine threat. He was afraid, and he was fighting anyway, which is an entirely different thing from not being afraid. I had seen fearless fighters before, and fearless fighters have a specific quality to their movement, a certain fluidity that comes from the absence of internal conflict. What I was watching was something more complex than fearlessness. It was a person who was afraid and had simply decided that the fear was not relevant to what needed to be done, and who had apparently made this decision so completely that it did not create any measurable delay between the moment of threat recognition and the moment of response. I had studied courage in many forms across 30 years of military briefings and historical records and first-hand observation of conflict. I had not, until that corridor in the Shardfields, watched it operating at that particular level of integration with simple practical function. 2 more shadow hunters came through the far end of the corridor. He did not pause. He adapted, instantly and completely, with a speed of adjustment that was clearly not the absence of thought, but the product of a mind that processed threat and available response simultaneously rather than sequentially. He used the angles of the corridor. He used the fact that the 2 new attackers had to navigate around each other, creating a coverage gap that lasted approximately 2 seconds. He used that gap with a precision that suggested he had identified it before it existed, which meant he had been calculating the geometry of the space while fighting the first attacker, which was the kind of parallel processing that I had only ever seen in the most experienced combat veterans, regardless of species. I was not passive during this engagement. I defended myself with the blade I carry, and I accounted for my immediate space, and I kept moving toward the shelter. But I was also watching, in the fractured seconds between my own movements, and what I was watching was something that did not have a clean category in my existing understanding. He was not physically superior to the shadow hunters. He did not have the regenerative capacity or the natural structural reinforcement that made certain species nearly impossible to stop in close engagement. What he had was something that operates differently, a complete and matter-of-fact refusal to accept that the situation exceeded what he could manage, running alongside a mind that was solving problems 3 decisions ahead of the one immediately in front of him. It looked almost relaxed. It was the furthest thing from relaxed. It was the most focused thing I had ever seen, dressed in the appearance of calm. When the corridor was quiet and the emergency lighting had settled into its steady functioning, Ethan was leaning against the wall with his left arm pressed against a cut that ran from below his elbow to his wrist. A long, deep cut from a blade that had caught him when he stepped between me and a strike approaching from my left side while my attention was engaged forward. He had moved into the path of that strike without visible calculation, as the next action in a sequence, the way a person steps around an obstacle because it is there and they are moving, and the step is what comes next. My guard medic arrived within 60 seconds. I stood at the edge of the corridor, and I tried to construct the appropriate formal response to what had just happened. Gratitude expressed correctly, commendation noted for the official record, acknowledgement of duty performed at a level that exceeded the standard definition. These were things I knew how to do. Nothing came. I stood there in the dim light, and the words simply were not present. He looked up from where he was sitting against the wall, with his arm extended for the medic, and he found my eyes across the corridor. His expression was tired and steady, and there was something in it that was almost amused, in a way that had nothing to do with humor. "Told you I was worth keeping around, Your Highness," he said. I looked at him. The medic was working efficiently. Somewhere deeper in the ship, Commander Vale was coordinating the security sweep, and the normal sounds of a ship returning to order after a crisis were beginning to reassemble themselves around us. The sounds of function resuming. I did not answer. I was not capable of answering in that moment, and recognizing that incapacity in myself was itself unusual enough that I noted it. I stayed beside him while the medic worked. I did not return to my quarters directly after the medic finished. I stayed in that section of the corridor for longer than was strictly necessary, walking the space slowly after the security sweep had cleared it, looking at the places where the shadow hunters had come from, and the places where the engagement had moved, and the specific position of the maintenance panel that Ethan had used. I was not doing this for tactical reasons, though I would have described it that way if anyone had asked. I was trying to understand the sequence of decisions that had produced the outcome I had witnessed, and particularly the decision that had placed him between me and the blade. A champion's legal obligation requires physical protection of the bonded royal. That obligation covers the general requirement to maintain the royal's safety within reason and with appropriate regard for the champion's own survival, because a dead champion provides no protection at all. The legal texts are specific about this. The obligation to protect does not extend to a requirement of sacrifice, and a champion who places themselves in clear and certain danger to defend the royal is performing above the legal standard rather than within it. He had performed above the legal standard without appearing to notice that he was doing so, which was the part that kept requiring examination. It was not heroism in the performed sense, not a decision that required visible stealing or deliberate override of self-preservation. It was something quieter than that, more deeply integrated into the way he simply moved through situations. He had stepped into the path of the blade the way a person steps onto a bus, because it was where the next step went, and that was sufficient reason. I stood close enough that my presence was clear and said nothing. No one commented. Not even Advisor Drath, who missed nothing in her vicinity and had 20 years of practice at knowing when not to observe. Later, alone in my study, I reviewed the engagement recording. I reviewed it 3 times for tactical content, cataloging the decisions and their outcomes, and then twice more for something I did not have a precise name for. I found the moment when he had stepped into the blade's path and ran the trajectory analysis that confirmed what I had seen, that he had had no defensive reason to be in that position, that the movement had been too fast for deliberate calculation, that it had been instinct. The instinct to put himself between a threat and another person, without calculation, as naturally as breathing. No one in my household had ever done that without an explicit order. No one had ever done it simply because the moment existed and the choice was there. I closed the recording and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about what kind of person's instincts run in that direction and what it means to be in the presence of someone like that. He bled for me as though my life were worth more than his own. No one had ever done that without being ordered to. He had simply chosen. I agreed to the detour for reasons I framed as logistical, and the framing was not inaccurate. It was incomplete. The blade that had caught Ethan's arm was designed with a serrated geometry that created internal structural damage well beyond what the surface wound revealed. The ship's medical unit had correctly closed the surface, but the deeper reconstruction required equipment our ship did not carry. The nearest facility with the appropriate surgical capability was in orbit around Earth. We had 3 weeks before the Menvac Accord summit. The detour added 4 transit days each direction and gave us a week on site before we needed to depart. Advisor Drath presented the mathematics with the practiced neutrality she used when she had formed a personal view and was being careful not to express it. I approved the detour and told myself it was the efficient choice. I told myself that going to Earth was logistically sensible and personally irrelevant, that I had been within that solar system twice before and managed to feel nothing particular about it either time. What I had not done, either of those times, was step outside the ship onto the surface. This had always been, in my mind, a matter of schedule and priority rather than reluctance. I believed this about myself with complete sincerity. The medical facility was in a city called Portland, in the western region of North America. The procedure took 18 hours. I spent that time reviewing summit preparation materials and clearing a backlog of correspondence that had accumulated during transit. When Ethan was discharged the following morning, cleared for light activity and visibly incapable of remaining still, I informed him that I would use the remaining time on the ship to continue working before our departure. He looked at me with the expression I had catalogued by this point as the one that appeared just before he said something that required me to reconsider my position. "You've never been to Earth," he said. "That is correct. And you're going to leave without seeing any of it. My workload during this period has 2.5 open days," he said. "Your Highness." He placed the title the way he always placed it, punctuation rather than decoration. "I grew up 40 minutes from here. There's something I would like to show you, if you're willing. I was not willing. I said yes. The gap between those two facts was one I had been quietly working around for several weeks, and I was not yet prepared to examine it directly. The vehicle he drove was modest, and clearly used regularly for practical purposes rather than maintained for appearances. He drove without commentary, moving through traffic with the relaxed competence he brought to most physical tasks. The landscape changed as we left the city, first through dense infrastructure, then through agricultural land where the light moved differently across open space, then along a stretch of coast where the air had enough moisture to be something felt rather than just breathed. The quality of light in that region was something I had not anticipated, a depth to it, a layering, as though it was passing through something that had texture. I noted this privately and said nothing. His hometown was called Ashford, a coastal city that had clearly rebuilt itself more than once across its history. The specific look of a place that has been hurt and has not pretended otherwise. Older buildings with deep-cut facades standing beside newer construction that had gone up quickly and practically. The functional architecture of people who needed shelter before they needed beauty and built accordingly. The city had a physical weight to it, the gravity of a place that has survived things that could have ended it. The first thing I noticed on the main street was the wall. 30 meters of gray stone on the western side, filled edge to edge with carved names. Not painted or applied, carved directly into the stone, each name in careful lettering. Many were worn smooth by decades of touch, others still sharp, the newer additions sitting beside the old ones with the same weight. The names were dense and closely spaced, filling the wall from a height that required reaching down from above to a height that a small child could touch easily. At the base of the wall, in clusters placed beside specific names, there were fresh flowers, placed recently, with intention. I stood in front of that wall and read the names. Human names in their writing system, many of the same family names appearing beside each other in the stone, the same surnames repeated in different combinations, telling the story of who had lived in this place, and who had stayed, and who had not come back. The Cathani Contact War, Ethan said beside me. He named it the way you name something to someone who will understand the weight of the naming. A scouting party came through this region before the main defense line was established. The town lost 63 people in 4 hours. I knew the Contact War from official diplomatic documentation, a Cathani advance force, an interaction that escalated beyond any authorized parameters, humans defending with technology that was objectively inadequate for the scale of the threat and winning anyway. The official assessments used language like unexpected resilience and non-standard adaptive response, which were careful ways of saying that no one had predicted the actual outcome. Standing in front of that wall and reading those names, I understood something the official documentation had not conveyed. The Contact War was not an abstraction here. It was 63 specific people with specific names and fresh flowers at the base of the stone placed by people who were still alive and still making the trip to place them. The act of remembering was not ceremonial. It was ongoing and deliberate and deeply personal. A woman walked past the wall with a child who was perhaps 5 years old. The child stopped and reached up and placed a small hand on one of the names near the bottom, a name positioned at the exact height of a small hand, worn smooth by years of the same gesture. The woman put her arm around the child's shoulders without stopping walking. They continued on. I watched this and felt something shift in me that I could not precisely name. How do they keep going? I asked. I meant this specific town, and I also meant something more than this specific town, and Ethan understood both layers of the question. They remember, he said, and they don't stop. That's what we do. We lose things, and we remember them, and we keep going anyway. He said it the way he said things that had been true about his life for long enough that they no longer required explanation or emphasis. A statement of fact about his people, said by someone who had known it long enough that it was simply part of how he understood the world. I stood at that wall for a while, Then we walked further into the town, along the main street, past shops and a small park and a building that served as a community center. He pointed out things without making them into a presentation. A bakery that had been open for 40 years, a stretch of waterfront that had been rebuilt after a storm, a small library that was older than most of the surrounding buildings. We stopped for a while at a small waterfront area at the end of the main street, where there were benches and a low railing looking out over the water. The tide was going out, slowly, and the exposed ground at the water's edge had a particular smell that I did not have a reference for, but that seemed important to the atmosphere of the place. Specific and real, not the processed or filtered air of the spaces I usually occupied. Ethan sat on one of the benches, and I stood at the railing, and for a while neither of us said anything, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who have stopped needing to fill them. A fishing boat was working out toward the horizon, small and slow from this distance, moving with a particular steadiness that made it seem purposeful rather than adrift. I watched it until it was a small shape against the water. "When you were deployed," I said, "and there were difficult things, how did you manage what you carried with you afterward?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when a question deserved actual thought rather than a quick answer. "You don't carry it alone," he said. "That's the main thing. You let people in, not to fix it, because most of it can't be fixed, just to know it's there alongside you." I thought about this for a long time afterward, not because it was a new concept in the abstract. I had read the literature on community and shared resilience. I understood the principle, but because he had said it as a personal practice rather than a philosophy, as something he actually did rather than something he knew was theoretically correct. I had been ruling an empire for 30 years while carrying most of what I carried alone. I filed this observation away alongside the others I was accumulating about the cost of the distance I had maintained, and I let the tide continue going out. He was showing me where he was from. Not the landmarks of it or the history of it, but the texture of it, the ordinary daily fabric of a place where people lived their specific lives. His mother's house was on a quieter street near the water, modest, with a garden in front that was maintained with the consistent care of someone who found genuine value in the act of tending to living things rather than just the result of it. He knocked at the door rather than entering directly, a courtesy that told me something specific about how he moved through the world. He had lived here, but no longer assumed automatic access. He gave the house the respect of a guest, even though it was where he had grown up. His mother answered the door. She was compact in the way of someone who has carried significant weight for many years and has adapted to it efficiently rather than being diminished by it. Gray hair pulled back practically, clear eyes, hands that were roughened from sustained practical use, the hands of someone who had worked with them throughout her life as a matter of course. She looked at her son and stepped forward and held him without a word. He held her back carefully because of his arm. When she stepped away and looked at him, she was doing what I recognized across all the species lines I had ever crossed, reading him, checking the things that cannot be conveyed in any form of communication, satisfying herself that the person who had come back was whole. Then she looked at me. I was standing on her front step, four-armed, silver-skinned, formally dressed in imperial court attire that I had not thought to simplify before coming to a residential address, making whatever visual impression I was making. She looked at me without the brief management of response that most people produced when encountering me for the first time. Her eyes were clear and steady, and she was simply looking, taking in information, arriving at a conclusion about it. "You must be the princess," she said. "Empress designate," I said, "but yes." She reached out and took my lower right hand between both of hers. Her hands were warm, and the skin was roughened in the specific way that comes from decades of work done with them, from consistent practical use rather than management. She held my hand, and she looked at me steadily. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping my son alive out there." I had been addressed by heads of state and political figures who had spent entire long lives refining the weight that words can carry. I had sat in rooms where single sentences determined the futures of populated worlds. I had spent 30 years developing the capacity to receive significant communication without allowing its effect to be visible on my face. What this woman said to me on her doorstep went past all of that, past every trained response, past every layer of professional composure I had built and maintained across 3 decades. It went directly to something underneath all of those layers and stayed there. She was not thanking me for strategic value or political alliance or any of the calculations that govern formal expressions of gratitude at the level I operated at. She was thanking me because her child had come home alive, and she said it with the directness of someone who had stopped believing that there was any more useful way to express a true thing than simply expressing it. I could not speak. I was aware this was visible. Both she and Ethan could see it. Neither of them commented. She made tea and food, and we sat at her kitchen table, and I watched Ethan talk with her about entirely ordinary things. A repair the roof was waiting for, a neighbor whose child had just been born, a plant in the garden that was struggling and might need to be moved to a different location to get better light. Each topic received its appropriate amount of attention, nothing inflated, nothing dismissed, everything given the weight it actually had, and no more. The conversation had the texture of 2 people who knew each other well enough to be plain about the things that were simply real. I sat at that table and felt something build in me the way a tide builds, gradually and inevitably arriving rather than striking. After dinner, his mother showed me the garden. She walked me through it with the same directness she brought to everything, naming the plants and explaining which ones were her choices and which had been there when she arrived and which had been planted by her husband before he died, 8 years ago, in a way that told me the information was factual rather than an invitation to respond to. I walked beside her and looked at the plants and listened, and somewhere in that walk I understood something I had been working toward for weeks, that she was not performing generosity for a visiting dignitary. She was simply being herself, in her own space, with a person she had decided to treat as present rather than as official. This was rarer than it should have been, in my experience. I had attended hundreds of official events and diplomatic dinners and formal occasions of every kind, and in almost all of them I was treated as official rather than as present, as a role rather than as a person who occupied the role. His mother had made a different choice within approximately 90 seconds of opening her front door, and the effect of it was still settling in me when we said goodbye and walked back to the vehicle. I looked back once at the house as we drove away. She was standing at the front window with the garden light on behind her, and she raised one hand when she saw me look back, a simple gesture, and I raised one of mine in return before the vehicle turned the corner. I had studied human culture in briefings and summaries and diplomatic preparation documents. I had formed assessments. I had met human officials and built professional relationships with some of them. All of it conducted from a position of professional evaluation rather than actual encounter. This was encounter, a kitchen table with marks from years of use, a mother's direct and simple thanks, a garden plant that needed more light, 2 people talking plainly about the texture of their lives. I had been studying this species from a very deliberate distance, and that distance had cost me something I had not known was missing until this moment. I did not fully understand yet what the cost was, or whether understanding it would require something I was ready to give. I filed that question alongside the others I was accumulating and did not examine it directly. Later, on the drive back to the city, the coast was visible to our right, and the light was turning gold and low over the water. I had been quiet for most of the drive. "Why didn't you take the transfer?" I asked him. He understood the question without needing clarification. His commanding officer had sent a formal inquiry at the end of his 3rd week, offering a return posting if he found the champion assignment unsuitable. He had declined in a single sentence. The file had no explanation attached. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with the care he applied to things he meant entirely. "Because you needed someone who wouldn't give up on you," he said, "even you." I turned to look at him. The light was at an angle through the window. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means you've spent a long time making sure nothing gets close enough to actually help you," he said, "and I decided someone should try anyway." I looked back at the window. The water was moving with the slowness of something patient. The light on the surface was doing something I did not have exact language for. I thought about many things on that drive, and I let all of them settle, without forcing them toward conclusions. Some things can only become clear without being pushed toward clarity, and I had 3 centuries of experience at knowing when to let things arrive rather than pursue them. I had ruled over star systems. I had never once been to a place that made me feel so terrifyingly, quietly small, and somehow, for the first time, not alone. The summons from the imperial court arrived 4 days into our return journey, and I read its tone before I read its content, because 30 years of correspondence from my uncle had taught me the particular quality of language he used when he had moved while my attention was elsewhere. High Regent Mareth Voss had called an emergency session of the Royal Council. The stated reason, in the formal administrative language that court documentation required, was a procedural review of succession protocols following extended royal absence. Translated from my uncle's specific diplomatic idiom, this meant he had identified leverage, assembled the necessary support, positioned his pieces, and was now issuing a formal invitation to the room where he intended to use all of them at once. The intelligence summary from my capital network was thorough and detailed. In the 8 weeks of my absence, the regent had held private meetings with 6 council members. 2 of these had been offered expanded trade authority in their home systems, authority that fell technically within the scope of his provisional powers but had historically been reserved for direct crown use. 3 had been offered relief from taxation obligations that the crown could waive at its discretion. The 6th meeting had been with Lord Kethavar, a military commander whose family held the largest privately controlled fleet in the eastern sectors, whose political ambitions had been noted in intelligence files for 2 decades, and whose usefulness to anyone applying pressure to a succession question was immediately apparent to anyone who read the same files. The proposal, structured clearly in the intelligence assessment, I would formalize a political union with Kethavar. His fleet's formal loyalty to the crown would be established by contract. The regent's challenge to my succession would be withdrawn in exchange for governance arrangements that such a union made both practical and appropriate for the regent's interests. If I declined, the regent would bring a formal motion before the full council arguing that my extended absence, my handling of the Menvac incident, and certain decisions I had made regarding my household and the champion selection since the ceremony demonstrated a pattern of judgment insufficient for the crown. The motion would be framed as a protective measure for the empire's stability rather than as a political power play, because my uncle was always thorough about framing. He had built this carefully and taken his time with it. I acknowledged the craftsmanship even as I was determining how to dismantle it. I found Ethan in the ship's exercise room, working through his daily training routine with the consistent purpose he brought to physical maintenance. He stopped when I came in, read my expression with the quiet accuracy he had developed over 10 months, and waited. I handed him the intelligence summary. He read it twice, once quickly for the overall structure, once slowly and carefully for the specific details. He set it down with deliberate care on the bench beside him. Kethavar's fleet is the actual mechanism, he said immediately. The council members give it political legitimacy, but without the fleet, as a credible threat, the motion has no real weight behind it. Yes, I said, and the union is not an option. I will not be arranged, I said, at any political price, under any framing. He nodded once, acknowledging this as settled. Then we need to understand what his coalition is actually made of, he said. Not what it looks like, but what's actually holding it together, and whether those things hold as well as he currently believes they do. He stood up and walked to the narrow observation window at the far end of the room. The transit corridor outside showed the featureless brightness of fold space, which has no visual content of its own, and which I had come to think of as the specific view people stare at when they need to think without distraction. "What do you want?" he asked. He asked it simply, as though it were the most obvious starting point, which it was, and which no one else on my staff had led with. They had presented options and calculated probabilities and modeled outcomes. Ethan asked what I actually wanted. "I want my throne on my own terms," I said. "I want the Menvac Accord concluded and the eastern border secured. I want to govern this empire without being managed by a man who has been waiting 20 years for me to make a mistake he could use." "Then we start with what's real versus what's constructed," he said. "A coalition built fast under pressure has weak points. We find them." What followed was well outside the legal definition of a champion's role in every direction. The Serenthari selection rite defines the champion function in physical and ceremonial terms, with specific language about personal security and formal accompaniment. Political intelligence analysis is not mentioned. Coalition mapping is not mentioned. Private conversations with conditionally aligned council members conducted over the course of diplomatic receptions are specifically not mentioned. Ethan did all of these things with the particular approach he brought to everything: purposeful, careful, and essentially invisible to anyone who had already decided he was not important enough to pay close attention to. His Serenthari had reached a level most people in the capital were not aware of, because he had consistently maintained the practice of speaking it imperfectly in public settings, in the slightly halting formal way of someone who is genuinely still learning. In private, he spoke it with a precision and range of register that had taken him 4 months to develop, and that I had watched him build through pure systematic effort, sourcing materials independently, practicing daily with household staff members who had developed genuine professional respect for him over the course of the year, treating every gap in his fluency as a specific technical problem with a specific technical solution rather than a general limitation. Over the 2 weeks of travel back to the capital, he identified which council members were structurally committed to the regent's position and which were conditionally aligned, which had received specific things in exchange for their support and might, under the right conditions, reconsider. He identified the specific conditions that had purchased their alignment. He cross-referenced these against things that were within my legal authority to offer, without requiring council approval or treasury intervention. He built a precise picture of the regent's coalition, not its surface presentation, but its actual composition, which turned out to be meaningfully different. The 2 weeks of preparation work produced something else I had not anticipated: a change in how my household staff moved around him. It had started, I think, with the navigator, who had spent an hour one afternoon answering Ethan's questions about the Shardfield's incident data, and had walked away from the conversation with the specific look of someone who has been taken seriously by someone they had not expected to take them seriously. It spread, in the way that shifts in professional culture spread, through individual encounters, through observed behavior, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that someone is genuinely interested in the work, rather than performing interest for strategic reasons. By the time we reached the capital, Ethan had developed actual working relationships with the senior members of my household staff, not the formal professional relationships that position and protocol create, but the real kind that come from sustained attention and honest exchange. When he needed information, he asked the person who had it, rather than the person ranked, to provide it. When someone's work produced a result worth acknowledging, he acknowledged it specifically rather than in the general terms that formal acknowledgement typically uses. This was, I had observed, extremely unusual behavior in a person of his formal position in my household, and it had produced the predictable result. He knew more about the actual functioning of my court by the time we reached the capital than most people who had been part of it for years. Then he found the financial pattern, and this was the part that mattered most and needs to be described most precisely. he did not conduct an unauthorized investigation or access restricted information. What he did was request a set of publicly available trade filing documents through a standard diplomatic access protocol, and while reviewing those documents, he noticed a structural arrangement in several proxy agreements established by the Regent over the previous 4 years that matched something he had seen before. During his second combat deployment, his unit had supported a military intelligence investigation of a procurement arrangement that had been deliberately designed to resemble legitimate trade while functioning as a systematic resource diversion. The structural signature of that scheme, the specific layering approach, the timing offsets between document filings, the particular way certain documentation cross-referenced without directly connecting, was distinctive enough to be recognizable when he encountered a similar pattern in the public filings now in front of him. He pulled every relevant public record he could access. He organized them himself, on paper, in the evenings after his official duties were complete, arranging the documents spatially in a way that made the relationships visible as a whole rather than as individual elements. He worked on this for 9 consecutive evenings without telling me, and he brought it to my strategy table 3 evenings before we reached the capital, with everything assembled and in order. He walked me through it in clear, careful language. The documents were not proof of wrongdoing in a simple legal sense. There was no single document that constituted an obvious violation. What they were was the specific pattern of something constructed to appear as one thing while functioning as another, which, presented to the correct legal authority with the right procedural framing, would create obligations that my uncle could not exit through political maneuvering or personal charm. I looked at what was on my table for a long time. "You did this in the evenings," I said. "Most evenings, yes. Without being asked, yes. Why?" He gathered the papers with his characteristic tidiness, aligning the edges carefully before he answered. "Because it needed to be done, and I could do it. And because you deserve to walk into that room with something that actually works, not just the right to be there." I looked at him across the table in the low light of my study. The ship was quiet around us in the late hour. Outside the windows, transit space moved past in the slow, featureless way it does during approach trajectory. "A champion's role is physical protection," I said. "A champion's role," he said, "is to serve the person they're bonded to. What that looks like depends on what that person actually needs." It was simply true. I had nothing to place against it. We arrived at the imperial capital on a clear morning, and I spent the 2 days before the session doing what needed to be done. I met privately with a legal advocate and filed the financial documentation through the appropriate administrative channel so its existence was on official record before the session began and could not be dismissed as a last-minute surprise rather than a procedural submission. I had 3 specific private conversations with conditionally aligned council members about matters that were within my legal authority to address. I prepared my formal presentation with the care I gave to every document that mattered. I did not rehearse my posture or my expression, because I had been doing this work for 30 years and the preparation lived in me rather than in my notes. The session was staged well. My uncle had spent months on the arrangement, and he opened it with the calm authority of someone who had been certain of an outcome long enough to have stopped imagining alternatives. He presented his case methodically, with evidence carefully selected and framed, building toward a conclusion that several uncertain council members appeared to be finding persuasive as his presentation continued. Then I presented the financial documents. I did it without accusation or emotional appeal. I presented it as information the council had a legal obligation to review before making any succession determination, submitted through the correct channel with the relevant legal advocate present and the filing reference on record. The council had no procedurally available option except to receive it and take it under consideration. The session ran 4 hours beyond its scheduled close. By the end, the regent had been referred for formal financial review under a timeline that effectively suspended his interim authority pending the outcome. Kethavar's proposal collapsed within 48 hours of the session, as proposals consistently collapse when the political architecture that made them useful ceases to exist. 3 council members who had been maintaining careful public neutrality for weeks found it an appropriate moment to register their formal support for the rightful succession. I was confirmed as Empress Designate by an 11-2 vote in the Hall of the Ancient Seals, under the portraits of 21 generations of Serenthari rulers. The days between the session's end and the formal confirmation vote were the quietest part of the entire conflict, which is characteristic of political crises after their turning point, the moment when the outcome is clear and the machinery simply requires time to complete what has been decided. Ethan used those days to clear the backlog of Republic communications that had accumulated during the preceding weeks, to take a long walk through the capital's older districts that he said he had been curious about, and to finish a report on Kethrul defensive countermeasures that he had apparently been drafting for Commander Vale's reference in his own time over the previous 2 months. He had not mentioned the report to me. Vale mentioned it when submitting his formal monthly security assessment, in a footnote that said the document had significantly improved his team's preparedness protocols. I read the footnote 3 times and said nothing about it in the formal review, because there was nothing to say in a formal review context that would have been adequate to the actual information it contained. The formal confirmation vote was on a Thursday morning, 11 members of the council in favor, 2 against, both of whom had been structurally committed to the regent's position regardless of evidence or outcome. The motion carried. The formal declaration was signed. I was Empress Designate, with full executive authority, the succession question legally resolved and documented. I had expected to feel relief primarily. What I felt was relief and something else, a particular kind of clarity that comes after the end of a sustained effort, when the thing you have been working toward is finally simply done and you can look at it directly rather than at the approach to it. Walking out of that hall through the long formal corridor, I stopped when we reached the private passage. Everyone stopped with me. I turned around and looked at Ethan. "Thank you," I said. 2 words, said simply, without the formal additions that would have made them technically correct and actually smaller than they were. He nodded once. "You did the hard part," he said. "You walked into that room. My ancestors ruled through bloodline and fear. I chose, in front of every ancient eye in that chamber, to rule through something my people had long forgotten, loyalty freely given." The year ended the way things that genuinely matter tend to end, not with a defining moment, but with a quiet one, on a cold and clear night on an observation platform above the capital city, looking at the stars. Before that night, there was everything else, and everything else was significant. The Menvac Accord was signed 4 months after the council session, in a ceremony that was smaller and more practical than the original summit would have been, which I considered a strict improvement. The final terms were more specific and more enforceable than the preliminary version, because we had used the additional time to address the ambiguities that previous negotiating teams had left deliberately vague in the interest of reaching agreement faster. I had learned across 3 decades that ambiguities left in treaties are borrowed time rather than saved effort. They do not disappear, they simply appear later, in sharper forms, with less room to address them gracefully. The Menvac Accord, in its final version, addressed the things that had historically been the fault lines between the parties, in language that left limited room for creative interpretation. 2 star systems that had existed in political ambiguity for 11 years were formally integrated into Serenthari jurisdiction with proper council representation, ending a source of recurring low-level instability that 3 consecutive administrations had managed around rather than resolved. The insurgent coalition that had organized and funded the Shadowhunter attack on our convoy was dismantled in a coordinated intelligence operation over the following months. An operation that required the first formal cooperation between Serenthari Imperial Intelligence Services and the Human Republic's Military Intelligence Division. I had drafted the cooperation agreement, Several sections of its practical operational language were better than anything my diplomatic team had produced in the first draft, and I will acknowledge, in this account which is my own private record, that the person who identified the specific weaknesses in my team's language and suggested the improvements that addressed them was Ethan Cole, who continues to demonstrate that the formal scope of any role assigned to him is not the scope of what he actually does, and who has apparently decided that this is simply true and requires no further comment. The changes to the court moved at the pace institutions move, slower than anyone directly affected by them would prefer, faster than the institutions themselves typically acknowledge, but they moved. I opened 3 advisory positions to non-Serenthari applicants for the first time in the court's documented history. The legal path to doing this already existed in the ancient records. The relevant precedent was there, simply unused for so long that it had ceased to function as a living part of the court's self-understanding. One position went to a Voxian border conflict scholar whose published work I had followed for over a decade. One went to a Dravaki infrastructure specialist with specific expertise in post-conflict economic reconstruction. One went to a human named Claire Whitmore, whose background in resource allocation and conflict economics was precisely what my Eastern administrative offices had been failing to find through traditional channels for over a year. Claire arrived with a thorough preparation file and professional steadiness, and in her first week of work, she made one structural observation about the Eastern fiscal allocation system that eliminated approximately 14 months of future administrative negotiation. I noted this with the particular satisfaction of seeing a decision proven right in practice rather than just in principle, and I noted also that the observation she made was the kind that only becomes visible to someone approaching the system from outside its established assumptions, which was exactly why I had opened the position to external candidates. The revision to the champion tradition itself was moving through the legal scholarly process at the pace such processes maintain by design, which is measured in years rather than months, and which I had stopped trying to accelerate. The foundation I had built was solid: the historical precedent documents, the formal record of non-traditional selection right outcomes that I had compiled over the previous months, the legal analysis that framed the proposed revisions as a return to original intent rather than a departure from established tradition. The scholars would reach their conclusions when the process was complete. In the meantime, I found the compilation project itself genuinely interesting in ways I had not anticipated. There was something worth paying attention to in the patterns of what the crystal had chosen across 21 generations, and I had begun writing an analysis of those patterns that was entirely for my own understanding and that I had told no one about. Ethan's bonded term ended on a clear Wednesday morning, 612 days after he had walked through the wrong door on Urith Station holding a paper cup of something that steamed. The completion ceremony was brief and held in a small chamber in the administrative wing rather than the Hall of Champions, because I had revised the completion protocol when I reviewed it and found that the original version required the full imperial court to observe, which served ceremony rather than the people involved in it, and which I had no interest in maintaining for its own sake. The court's ceremonial advisor read the completion declaration. The crystal, which had been dark and quiet in its display case in my study for most of the year, was formally acknowledged as closed. The legal bond was complete. Ethan stood through the reading with the focused patience he brought to all formal procedures, which meant he was paying full and genuine attention while also quietly tracking the remaining time, not because he was impatient, but because he found it easier to be present in formal settings when he had a clear sense of their duration. Afterward, there were Republic documents to process. His secondment had been extended twice through proper administrative channels over the course of the year, and the final completion generated the standard package of forms confirming his return to standard service status. He sat at a desk in the administrative wing and worked through them with efficient, clear handwriting, and thanked the administrative officer who managed the process with the specific attentiveness he consistently gave to people who did their work carefully, regardless of how significant their role was in any formal hierarchy. I stood in the doorway of the adjoining room and looked at correspondence that required nothing of me and received nothing from me. He finished and stood, and the room was quiet, and I walked out into the corridor. He followed. This was a pattern so established between us across 10 months that neither of us gave it any conscious thought. He moved with me the way he had moved for the entire duration of the bond, present, aware, slightly to the side and slightly behind, the specific positioning of someone who has made a sustained and genuine practice of knowing what was happening in the space around the person near them. I walked to the observation platform on the north side of the central tower. The platform faced away from the city's light and gave an unobstructed view of the star field in the direction that included, at this time of year, the faint yellow point of Earth's sun. I had come here a number of times over the past months. I had told myself each time that I came for the quality of the view and the quietness of the location, both of which were genuinely good. I had been avoiding examining why a specific point of light in a specific direction had become something I consistently returned to look at. I was done avoiding that examination. The deadline of his departure had ended the period during which avoidance was a functional strategy. We stood at the railing together. The night was cold and the stars were very clear, the kind of clarity that comes when the atmosphere is still and there is no competing light. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The silence was the comfortable kind, not empty, but full of things moving through it without needing to be named immediately. "What do you see?" I asked. He understood that I was not asking casually. He looked at the star field for a moment with a particular quality of attention, the kind that suggests something is being felt rather than just processed. "Home," he said, "and somewhere I don't entirely want to leave." I looked at the stars. I had been approaching something with care for several weeks, circling it at a distance, understanding its shape without looking at it head-on. The approaching deadline of his departure had ended the option of continued approach. Some things can only be clearly seen when the alternative to seeing them becomes specific and imminent and real. "I need to tell you something," I said. He waited, with the active quality of his attention that I had never once taken for granted. "In the shard fields, when you stepped between me and that blade," I said, "I reviewed the engagement recording 7 times across the following 3 days. I told myself on each viewing that I was conducting tactical analysis. There is no tactical justification for reviewing a single engagement recording 7 times. I was looking at the moment when you made that choice, and trying to understand the person who makes a choice like that in a fraction of a second, without calculation, as though it were simply the next thing to do." "Did you figure it out?" he said quietly. "It took longer than it should have," I said. "On Earth, when your mother held my hand and thanked me, I was not able to speak for a moment. 300 years of developed social capacity, and I could not produce a response to 8 words said directly on a front doorstep. I thought about that moment for weeks afterward. I went back through the images in my files from that day. I read everything I could find about Ashford and the Contact War and the specific way that town rebuilt itself, and I could not explain why I needed to understand it so thoroughly until recently." "What happened recently?" he asked. "Your departure was scheduled," I said. And I understood that what I had been trying to understand, through all of it, the recording and the wall and your mother and every question I asked you that was not about security or diplomatic protocol, what I was trying to understand was you, specifically and particularly, the specific person that you are. Because that person matters to me in a way that did not exist in my life before you walked through the wrong door, and the thought of your absence feels the way it feels, and I have been working very hard to avoid naming that directly for longer than I should have." "How does it feel?" he asked. I had prepared several possible answers over the previous days, arranged them in order of precision, and considered which one was most accurate. In the actual moment, on the platform in the cold, clear night with the deadline immediate, and the stars above us, and no useful purpose served by any further indirection, I chose the simplest, true answer. Like the prospect of losing something I did not know I had until it was nearly gone, I said, and I would prefer not to lose it. The stars moved slowly above us as the platform's rotation carried us through the sky. The yellow point of his sun had shifted slightly in its position since we had come out. "You're asking me to stay," he said. "I am asking you to choose," I said, "freely, not under any right, not under any law, not because anything obligates it. As whatever this is between us, if you want it, on equal terms." He looked at me with the expression I knew, the one he wore when he was about to say something he meant entirely, without reservation, nothing withheld. Up close, in the starlight, that expression was not imprecise at all. It was simply him. "You know," he said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and completely serious and gently amused all at once. For someone who spent several months reminding herself that humans are short-lived and primitive, you sure did take a long time to ask. "From a 300-year perspective," I said, "1 year is considered quite efficient decision-making." He laughed. I had been quietly keeping count of the times I heard him laugh across the year, not as data collection, but because I noticed each one and had never once been able to stop noticing. Standing on that platform in the cold night air, this one was not a data point or an entry in any catalog. It was simply the sound of someone genuinely and completely happy, near me, without anything held back. "Yes," he said. "Yes, to which part?" "All of it," he said. "The choosing. The staying. Whatever this is. All of it, yes." I looked at him, and something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time simply released, and I did not try to manage it, or decide in advance how it should appear, or construct the appropriate formal response to it. I let it be exactly what it was. I had never laughed easily in my life. I had used laughter at correct moments in my political work, the light response that diffuses, the shared amusement that builds rapport, the carefully timed levity that signals safety in a tense room. What happened on that platform was none of those things. It came from somewhere that had not been accessed in longer than I could honestly calculate, and it came because he had said exactly what he meant in the plainest available words, and meant every syllable of it, which was one of the most consistent things about him across the entire year, and which had never once become ordinary to me or ceased to catch me slightly off guard. He watched me and smiled in the way he smiled when something genuinely pleased him, the specific smile that reached his eyes rather than existing only in his face, and the look on his face was one I had never seen exactly replicated on any other person in 300 years of watching people, and it was one I intended to know for a very long time. In the morning, there would be council preparations and summit outcome reviews, and an empire to continue governing. There were legal revisions moving through scholarly process in 3 separate departments, and diplomatic negotiations active in 4 different systems and administrative appointments to review, and a dozen ongoing matters that required careful and sustained attention. The work was large and continuous and demanding, and would remain all of those things for as long as I ruled, which by Serenthari biological standards was likely to be another 2 centuries at minimum. The morning would have all of that. On the platform, in the cold and very clear night, I let myself be fully present in a single moment, without management and without reservation, which was something I had not done in longer than I could honestly calculate. They said he was an accident, a glitch in the ceremony, a human in the wrong hall at the wrong moment. Perhaps, but I have ruled long enough to know that the universe makes very few mistakes. He did not transform my empire, though he helped me build a better one. He did not transform my politics, though he showed me what loyalty looks like when it is chosen freely rather than purchased or commanded or required by ceremony. He did not change the wall in Ashford or the names carved into it or the flowers that are still placed there by people who still make the journey to place them. He transformed me, and that, I have decided, is the only conquest that ever truly mattered. The resonance crystal sits in its display case in my study now, dark and quiet, its work complete. Sometimes I look at it and think about what it recognized on that morning, in the Hall of Champions, that 300 years of my own careful judgment had completely failed to see. Then I hear him in the next room, asking one of my senior advisors a question that no one had thought to ask before, that will turn out to be exactly the right question, and I think that the crystal was, as it has been across 21 generations of Serenthari history, precisely correct. It simply understood something that I needed a full year to catch up to. Some lessons can only reach the people who were not expecting them. I was not expecting Ethan Cole. I was not expecting what followed from him, or what it would require of me, or what it would become. I was not expecting to find, in the specific accident of a wrong transit platform on a station I had barely registered booking passage through, something that would outlast every treaty I have ever signed and matter more than any border I have ever secured. I was not expecting any of it. I am glad, with the particular gladness of someone who has been surprised by something better than what they had planned for, that it came anyway.